Okay, welcome back. Now that we saw how to select the different components and what components make up the sub-D object, now you have to learn how to manipulate these components and how to move them around and change their location, shape, etc., etc. This is the next step in being able to model with sub-Ds. So let's go ahead and do that. Each component of this sub-D can be moved around, it can be rotated, and some of them can even be scaled. This changes the shape of the object, obviously, and is a fundamental part of the process to model with sub-Ds. So let's see how to do that. Over here in MCP, under the transform area, you're going to see this S button, R, and T. S stands for scale, R stands for rotate, and T stands for translate, which is just a fancy word that means move, to move around. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit U on the keyboard to switch to polygon raycasting mode. And now I can click and say, for example, select this polygon on the right. Now if it's selected, I can hit the T button over here in the MCP, and this activates something called a manipulator. And this manipulator can be used to move that selected polygon around with these different arrows. Now each arrow corresponds to a different axis. The Y arrow, for example, is the Y axis, the red one is X, and the blue one is Z. And you could see underneath my mouse cursor when I hover over one of these, it turns yellow, and then the letter corresponding to that axis pops up to let me know which axis that is. But they're color coded, so you don't even have to read that. You'll just know automatically from looking at the color of the arrow. So all I have to do to use this manipulator is pretty simple. I just hover over one of the arrows to make it turn yellow, and then I left click and drag with the mouse, and I can move this polygon up or down. I can also use the red arrow to stretch it out sideways, or use the blue one to stretch it out or move the polygon forward and backwards. It's just moving the polygon, it's not actually scaling it, not with this manipulator at least. If we go over here and click on the R, we'll activate the rotate manipulator, which looks like several rings pretty much going around each other. And then what we can do is just hover over one of these rings so it turns yellow, and just go ahead and left click and drag, and you'll go ahead and rotate that polygon on the respective axis that you're using. So it's pretty simple. Then we can switch to the S tool over here by clicking on the S, and that activates the scale tool, which looks like several boxes. And now what we can do is simply click on one of these and just, well, that one's not going to work because that's the Y axis. Obviously it's a flat polygon, we can't make it thicker like that. So in this case, we can only go ahead and scale it in the X-axis or the Z-axis. Okay, we can also input certain numbers in here to control that a little bit better. Say if we want to go ahead and precisely change the scaling in the X-axis of this polygon to 2 times its regular size, I'll just type in 2 in the X value over here, hit enter, and there we go, it's scaled out. Actually, we're going to edit that part out of the video. Edit that part out of the video. And we're starting again in 3, 2, 1. Let me show you something else here. If we hit V on, if we go ahead, edit that part out of the video. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. Now let me show you something a little bit different here. Let's hit T over here to activate the translate tool. And say for example, right now this polygon is set at a height of 0. We can actually change that and put it to a height, say, of 2, hit enter, and now it'll move up 2 units. So you can use these numerical channels or numerical fields to input specific and precise numbers as to where you want that component to move to, what size you want it to scale to, or how many degrees you want it rotated. So that's pretty useful. Now, what you want to do is use the shortcuts instead, because the shortcuts are going to be the best and fastest way to work in XSI. You don't want to be coming to this menu and hitting the R button, rotate this thing, come over here and hit, say, the T button, then move it, and so on and so forth. That gets really tedious, and it's just going to add extra hours to your overall project time, which you really don't have to. So what are the shortcuts? Well, V for Victor on the keyboard activates the translate tool, and you can see it did when I clicked it by activating this T button over here. If you hit C on the keyboard for Charlie, it activates the rotate tool, and X activates the scale tool. So you might want to go ahead and start using those shortcuts as soon as you memorize them and learn them, practice a bit. Once you get used to them, it'll become second nature. You'll also notice that if we right click with any one of these manipulators used, so you can be in scale mode, rotate mode, or translate mode, and you right click over here anywhere in empty space, you'll activate a little sub menu, which is a shortcut menu to the same buttons that are located down here underneath these tools. So you could switch to global mode, local mode, parent mode, or activate any of these buttons such as COG, for example, which stands for Center of Geometry. And it allows you to do it very quickly without having to come over here and click on any of these buttons, which is just great. Okay, so there's actually a couple more ways that we can interact with this manipulator as opposed to just coming over here, clicking this arrow and dragging it, clicking this arrow and dragging that. You notice that there is this yellow square that's facing us right now, and it's in the middle of the manipulator. It's looking right at us, that yellow square in the middle of all those arrows. And it actually has a purpose. It's not there just to be a cool design or anything like that. It actually has a significance to it. It has a use. So what is the use? Well, when the square is facing us, like right now, what we can do is left click and drag somewhere out here in empty space. And you notice that all three arrows become highlighted in yellow. And if we click and drag with the mouse, we can actually move this manipulator without even touching it. And we can move this very freely. This is a free-form movement. It's not precise at all. So if you're looking for precision, like placing an object specifically on top of a table, for example, you probably don't want to use that method because that method is kind of a freestyle method which has no precision. It's just basically for eyeballing objects into position. If you want precision, use these arrows. That way you can lock the movement only in the y-axis or only in the x-axis, and so on and so forth. So this left clicking in empty space and dragging is a more freestyle way of moving objects and components around in XSI. There's another way that we can actually move components. You notice that it may get pretty tedious after a while having to come over here, grab these arrows, and move them all over the place. It gets pretty annoying actually. So there's another way that we can manipulate this manipulator, no pun intended, using this empty space out here. The problem is if we use the left mouse button, this is not precise. Well, if we use the middle mouse button, XSI is so smart that it reads our minds. Okay, it doesn't really read your mind, but it's pretty cool what I'm about to do right here. If you use the middle mouse button and click it in and hold it and then drag up, for example, XSI is smart enough to know that you're trying to move in the y-axis or up on the screen. If you go ahead and use the middle mouse button and then you drag in the direction of the red arrow, you'll move in that direction as well. And of course, if I middle mouse button click and drag in the direction of the blue arrow, this component is going to move only in that axis. So it's basically the same as coming over here and clicking on these arrows with the left mouse button and dragging, only without having to waste time moving the mouse over here and trying to click on these arrows perfectly. You can just do it straight from anywhere where there's empty screen space over here in the viewport, which is fantastic. And that actually saves a lot of time on your projects when you add in all the time that you saved from doing that. Now, the last way of manipulating with this thing is the little yellow square in the center of the manipulator. If we move our mouse cursor in between this green arrow and this red arrow, watch what happens with the yellow square in the middle of the manipulator. Did you catch that? Right here it's facing us, and here it changes its orientation, so it's basically like this flat piece of paper that's placed from this green arrow to this red arrow, as you can see. So what happens is when we left click here, you'll see the green and the red arrows, or the Y and the X axis, become highlighted, and those are active. We're basically constraining movement only to those two axes right now. So it's moving up and left and right at the same time, but it's not moving forward and backwards. It's not moving on the Z axis. We can also move the mouse cursor in between the green and blue arrows, and now we can move in these two directions at the same time while not moving in the X axis or the red arrow. And if we move the mouse down here, you probably guessed it, we can move this in the Z and X axis while leaving the Y axis completely alone. So this object is not going to move up and down, it's just going to move forwards, backwards, left and right. So that's another way of moving precisely, using only two different axes at the same time while leaving the third one completely alone. So those are the three different ways to use these manipulators. And if you go ahead and use the, for example, the rotate manipulator, you notice that you can do similar things, like click in here in the middle to go ahead and move this around freely. If we click out here, we move this based on our screen viewpoint. And of course we can use the middle mouse buttons too to rotate this however we want. And the scaling tools work the same exact way. So it's pretty simple to use, and it's very important to learn how to use this effectively. So there you go, there's the shortcuts, there's how to use the manipulator. Go ahead and practice with it for a bit, and then I'll see you in the next video.